to judge, at least to judge by book titles. Madeleine Albright, Fascism: A Warning, How Fascism Works, Jason Stanley, Paul Mason, How to Stop Fascism, all have appeared in the last 3 years, along with innumerable articles about the relevance of fascism to discussing European politics today. And we thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation about this. A few questions that came to my mind, but there will be others from the panelists on the floor. The first is, why are people talking again about fascism so much? My very superficial impression is that, oddly enough, it was the election of Donald Trump that was the real trigger for the discussion, and not anything, not Marine Le Pen, not Viktor Orban, not anything in Europe. Secondly, what value is added analytically by using the term fascism to describe what are otherwise called far right, radical right, extreme right, nationalist, populist parties, movements, or in the case of Poland and Hungary, governments. What value is added analytically, and does that value outweigh the obvious disadvantage, namely when you say fascism, people immediately think of these guys, Hitler and Mussolini. That's Martin Kitchen's book from the mid-70s, and rather obvious that the people we're talking about today then control one of the most powerful states in Europe and are not bent on using its power for genocide and total war, but also the obvious disadvantage that the term has been so much devalued by overuse by the left for many, many years. So does the advantages of using the term outweigh those disadvantages? Might it be more sensible to talk about fascist elements or traces or aspects of these movements? And of course, then the question of continuity, because in the case of a party like Fratelli d'Italia, for example, you have an actual continuity from fascist to neo-fascist to current parties. To discuss those and other questions, we have an absolutely terrific panel. I'm going to introduce them very, very briefly, really just signaling their expertise just for this subject only. On my right, Jane Caplan, former professor of German history in this university, former director of this center. I think it's fair to say, Jane, you spent much of your life dealing with these questions around and debates around fascism, including also very lively debates in the 60s and 70s, through her work on Nazi Germany in particular, but also more broadly. But she's also published a couple of very interesting recent articles in History Workshop on the applicability or otherwise of the term today. We will then go, I'm very glad to say, to our new fellow, Lenka Bustikova, currently still in beautiful Arizona. On the screen, Lenka will be joining us next academic year as our new fellow in European Union and comparative East European politics. She has published widely, but particularly on the subject of far-right parties in Central and Eastern Europe, a celebrated book called Extreme Reactions, looking in detail at far-right parties in Slovakia and Ukraine. We will then come to our colleague Othon Anastasakis, director of the CSOC, Circuit European Studies program in this center, who, amongst his many other subjects of interest, has written extensively on populist and far-right parties in Southeastern Europe. And also, by the way, has rather relevantly a very interesting new volume on the Greek military dictatorship, just out and available on all good Amazons. And finally, we will come to our colleague Tim Vlandas, professor of social policy, who has written extensively on the connections between electoral politics, public policy, and interestingly, welfare states in Western and Southern Europe. So we have a great panel. Jane will have about 10 minutes to give us a historical perspective, 5 to 7 minutes for each of the other panelists, and then we'll have plenty of time for discussion. Jane.
Thanks so much. I have to say I'm not sure whether I can pack fascism into 10 minutes. And when you said that I spent most of my life working on this, that is true. One of our colleagues, Roger Griffin, who also spent much of his life working on fascism, once pointed out that one of the reasons that we find fascism so hard to define is precisely because so much attention has been focused on it. In some ways, the more that it gets written about, the less clear it is what it actually is. I'll come back to that in a second. I know it's the case that some far-right politicians would rather we didn't use the term fascism. And Marine Le Pen tried in 2012 and again in 2014 to get a legal ruling against, in the first case, a comedian, and in the second case, Jean-Luc Mélenchon, because they had called her party fascist or called her fascist. So that's the horse's mouth, reminding us of the almost universally pejorative understanding of the term. And I must say, if even the fascists don't want to be called fascists, then I'm inclined to use the term. As Tim said, and this has always been clear to me, well, at least I'm glad to have this point endorsed, it was Trump's election that caused the real fluttering in the dovecots among historians. I don't mean to say that other issues aren't, or other parts of the world are not important, but it was such an extraordinary event. It was a kind of work, it was not, once you dig into it, it turns out, of course, like all these things, not to have been unexpected or not to have lacked a prehistory. But one of the reasons I think was that he excels in the fascist style, rather as if Charlie Chaplin had preceded Hitler. And as Marx said, I mean, I'll put a word into him, in the 18th Brumaire, he sought to explain in that book how what he called grotesque mediocrity claimed to play a hero's part, and that would be a perfectly good epitaph. At least I hope it would be an epitaph. Now, I mean, this is a sort of a generic position with me. I think maybe it's more useful not to ask, are the politics of the present fascist, but is historic fascism good to think with in the Levi-Strauss view of the world? Can we use it to expose not just comparabilities, but also differences? I mean, I think this will come up further in discussion. I'm not going to attempt to do everything in my 10 minutes. I mentioned already that fascism is an extremely muddy concept. It's notoriously undecidable. I could quote from any number of historians saying it's impossible to define what it is. It's an impossibly vague concept. Ian Kershaw, one of the lions of our profession, described trying to write about fascism as like trying to nail jelly to a wall. And I think that's as good a definition as any. But I think there's also, if fascism itself is a very unstable and undecidable category, I think it is also destabilizing itself. I think it throws the normative categories that we often use to think historically or think politically into confusion. I think fascism introduces a sort of uncontained ideological disruptiveness onto the political scene. It certainly did in the 1920s and 1930s. And I think it still has the power to do that. I mean, obviously we've seen absolutely massive changes in the political field since, name it where you want to, since 1920s, since the 40s, since the 50s, whatever. But it's surprising in some senses that the categories left and right remain very durable. But even if we fill them in with different containers now, but it's precisely those categories that fascism disrupts, and I think that's why it makes it, it becomes such a difficult term. So political terms, therefore, in some sense, they don't exist independently of each other. They exist in a field of meanings, a field of semantic and political space, which is shared by other terms of the same order. And I've suggested that the field that fascism shares is one that is readily susceptible to confusion. And clearly, I mean, I think in some sense it's arguable that fascism is the oppositional category. It's not other things. It's itself very difficult to define that. It's also emerged in some senses as a movement of resistance to various historical events, which I'll come to in the second 10 minutes of my 10 minutes. And obviously one of the major oppositional categories for fascism was Bolshevism. now disappeared. So now we're looking in some senses to see what is what I call the politico-semantic space within which the current ultra-right operates. We'll come on to that again. There's obviously a new against, and that is the supranational. So just in its broadest terms, I don't think I need to go into that, but it can be institutions like the EU, any other international body you care to mention, whether it's the UN or the Court of The Hague or whatever, migrants or migrancy generally, another category of the international, eroding what is claimed by the defenders of national sovereignty, eroding not just national sovereignty, but national cultural heritages, identity, national community, independence, autonomy. I mean, any of the people that are going to be talked about here, you could quote endlessly from them. And so what I've chosen to do in what I'm coming on to say is to approach fascism not so much as a political concept or through its political ideology, its characteristics, but in the historical conditions of emergence that secured its ideology and political strategy in the political and cultural crisis after World War I. I mean, I think that if there are two terms that historians would agree, or two moments that historians would agree, it's World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution that are the conditions. Whatever other antecedents you want to look for and alternative sources, and of course non-European sources and so on. It's that double crisis, a crisis of the international order at two levels, the level of international relations and the level of what a polity is. So if one approaches it in terms of the conditions of its emergence, the conditions of its possibility, you could do that on different levels of abstraction, from descriptive history to full-blown theorization. And I'm one of many people who spent a lot of their youth, I don't think I'll call it entirely misspent, but quite a lot of my youth trying to work out precisely how to theorize fascism within the Marxist framework. Whether that was useful or not is left to the mice of history to decide. So just to enumerate 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 conditions of emergence. One is what I've already referred to as World War I. But the World War I is also the source for fascism of the original big lie. It is a mega whopper of a lie. The idea that it had not really been lost by Germany, so the myth of the stab in the back, which sounds like a little formulaic tag that one can learn and repeat, but it's an absolutely profound feeling right across German political culture, and it's weaponized from the far right down through, if you like, not perhaps far into the Social Democratic Party, but it's across the spectrum of German politics. And for Italy, the case is Italy was always understood to be the victor that sort of was cheated of its victory, although it was theoretically on the side. So this is a stage set for a huge politics you present as being cheated of something which actually was part of your patrimony. And I'm leaving all these terms hanging because I'm going to leave it to you to figure out what you think is appropriate for or relevant still to the present day. Then this produces, or at the same time, the war and post-war produces systemic crisis of capitalism and of the elite's hegemony in the face of the democratic franchise. So the liberal franchise, or the liberal politics of the 19th century, are yielding after 1918 to the democratic politics of the 20th century. And there's always this tension, I think, in democratic thought between the limited liberal concept of democracy and the more universal or university emancipationist or enfranchising concept of radical democracy. And I think that produces, in some senses, a very, very different and very dynamics, which are very difficult for the elites to control. Then, of course, in the context of the massive redrawing of the post-war political map of Europe and the world, there are projects all over Europe of renegotiation of what is meant by the nation, citizenship, representation, incorporation of the contemporary, what we often think of as modernity, but I would prefer to think of it as the contemporary. Seeing the contemporary, the battles over whether to see the contemporary as progress from some earlier, less favoured status, or decline from a mythicized past of national power and the normative gender order. And I want to stress, I won't have a whole lot to say about the gender order, but I think it is absolutely non-accidental that it is so prominent in the politics of Poland and Hungary at the moment. I think that, and I think its importance in the interwar period has been excavated, but relatively recently, let's say in the last 20 years. Then another legacy of the First World War crisis is an explicit culture of the militarization of politics and of normalized violence drawn from war and revolution. And I think, I mean, well, I will play one card of my hand, so to speak, because I think that in Europe, this militarized culture has been less prominent. I mean, it's been prominent where the situation has descended to actual fighting, as in ex-Yugoslavia, and pretty grim there too. But I think it's enormously prominent in the United States in the guise of the gun culture. I think that is actually, if you like, plays functionally the same role, potential role in the militarization of politics. And I'll leave my colleagues to talk about how far they think politics in other European countries has been militarized. Although one of the claims of historic fascism is to be not the elites, to be an upsurge, if you like, of people's power against the elites. An absolutely crucial role is played in the coming to power of fascism, both in Italy and in Germany, by the elites, by the political elites in particular, the liberal and conservative elites who are power brokers to sponsor a fascist leader or party to come to power in the atrophied pluralist politics of the time as a controllable bulwark against democracy. And it's not just the left that they're frightened of, it isn't just the spectre of Bolshevism, although that is constantly recognized in the deeply divided conditions of post-war Germany, but it's democracy itself that the elites are concerned about. And of course, I mean, none of this will be news to you, but the sort of absolutely fundamental miscalculation is their belief, either out of fear or out of hubris, that they can control the fascist party and the fascist leader. So the fascist synthesis is, in this post-First World War period, is not restoration. This is not 1850. Okay, it's a radical national project of regeneration and rebirth, and it's crucial that something has to be destroyed in order for the birth to begin again, for the nation, if you like, to come back into itself. The destruction of the political order, a new synthesis of national leadership, organic solidarity, self-sufficiency, repression of difference, which is obviously crucial in terms of gender as well as politics. In this sense, it's more than just anti-democratic authoritarianism. It has a cultural character to it, and I think we see some problematic echoes of that cultural attack. So, and under fascist regimes, finally, I realized that I very belatedly ought to say a few things, and these are just bullet points, if you like. Fascist regimes characterized by personalized rule, a leader or dictator exercising patrimonial power. And in fact, one historian, Dylan Riley, has gone so far as to develop quite an elaborate characterization of Trump as exercising patrimonial power. In other words, treating the public, everything from the public purse, the public stage to whatever, as his own private domain. Another feature of fascist regimes, I think, has been the radical disorganization of government routine, bringing with it the risk of cumulative radicalization of policy and practice. If that's completely clear in the case of Trump, I mean, you know, you could spot it from the very beginning, and any historian could have said, "Ah, yes," and pointed to the European regimes. I'll again leave it to my colleagues to say how far what I think of as a very important aspect of fascist regimes, this radical disruptiveness brought into the heart of the modern state. That's relevant to them. The other important points are, I think, that the fascist public is mobilized in the performance of this aspiration towards national hyperunity and identity and fealty to the leader. This is not a leader just sort of exercising power from above. This is a leader who conjures up their version of the people in mass rallies, in the organization of civic life and so on and so forth. I mean, as Habermas, I think, said, das Volk tritt nur im Plural auf. The people only appears in plural. But of course, the project of fascism is to force that difference out of it and ensure that the Volk, the people, only appears in singular. And the other thing, and perhaps because I haven't emphasized this enough, but the role of violence is not just in the militarized politics, but in the repression of the figures of the existential enemy, which takes place in a systemic, violent repression of political, racial, and gendered difference, which is figured in various forms before a takeover of power. But once fascist regimes are in power, I mean, with all the huge differences between regimes, there are many, many differences and details that one could parse about how violence develops as a tool of government, but it's certainly there from the very beginning. The mass interests, the beatings up, the essay on the street, and so on, the same with Scottish in Italy. I'll leave it at that. I mean, my final question would have been, if not fascism, what is it? And I'll leave that open. I think you probably will have some ideas on that.
Thank you very much, Jane. That was terrific. Many questions on the table. One, what is the other of fascism today? If it is fascism today, my immediate thought would be their answer is usually liberalism. It seems to me that is the umbrella term, which, if they are fascists, they use. Secondly, the very important point is that fascism is exploiting the weaknesses of democracy. It's not an alternative to democracy, it's exploiting the weaknesses, and in particular the majoritarian and plebiscitary versions of democracy. And thirdly, just to pick up a few of the many points, this question of violence, which is actually largely absent from many of the movements we're tempted to talk about as fascist in contemporary Europe. So I think
not in America, you see, I think it's there somewhere else, but it has erupted onto the political scene. That's what's so extraordinary and in many ways as alarming as the political changes, the political disruption.
Absolutely. Well, with that, let us go to Lenka. Lenka.
Hello, can you hear me?
We can hear you fine.
Okay, excellent. Thank you for the invitation to join this fantastic conversation today. I will make a few brief comments on the contemporary relationship between fascism and Central and Eastern Europe. In my view, it is very sensible to pay attention to fascist elements or aspects in contemporary right-wing politics in Central Eastern Europe, but not to fascism per se. So let me first outline 3 reasons why fascism is not a threat in Central Eastern Europe, and then I will speak about 3 fascist elements that are unfortunately quite relevant today. So there are 3 reasons why fascism is not a threat. Number 1 is demography. There are not enough young people to pull it off, and I will speak, briefly about violence, and it's a nice follow-up to what Jane just said. Number 2, the facade of democracy has a high value today, and number 3 is political fragmentation that serves as a bulwark against fascism. Unfortunately, there are 3 fascist aspects or elements that are relevant. Fascism is linked to sovereignty and is viewed as a usable past in some countries. Fascism, as was just mentioned, is a rejection of liberalism, individualism, and minority rights. It is extremely appealing to voters. And finally, I will meditate for a short period of time on the death of cultural progressivism in Central Eastern Europe. It is on life support, and only right-wing political alliances can defeat populists. So let me go briefly over these 6 3+3 elements. So demography, if we understand fascism as a violent mass movement of young or youngish people, it is not feasible today. There is no youth bulk in Central Eastern Europe, and right-wing parties from extremes to radicalized mainstream parties heavily rely on the votes of the older generation. Although there has been a proliferation of home guards that intimidate minorities and LGBTQ communities, parties in most cases keep them at arm's length. Violence is no longer, and brutality is no longer acceptable. As a political tool, the only exception might be Ukraine, theoretically speaking, where the conflict in Donbass is creating a class of parliamentarians and politicians with combat experience. And this is also in stark contrast to the United States, when violence seems to be quite acceptable these days. The facade of democracy, it pays off to be a democracy today. You get to be invited to the Summit for Democracy by Joe Biden and chit-chat. Of course, Hungary is out. There are substantial financial benefits reaped from the EU membership. Finally, as Tim was just saying, the competitor to liberal democracy is a democracy with an adjective. Orban's illiberal democracy, Putin's managed democracy, majoritarian democracy that facilitates executive overreach. Fascism is a big project to overhaul societies, as we just heard, and there is no demand for a big destruction. There is a demand for fine-tuning, in my view. Political fragmentation. Most party systems in Central Eastern Europe are fragmented, unstable, and use proportional representation, and Hungary stands out for a reason. It is very difficult to legitimately create supermajorities in parliaments that allow for massive executive overreach and concentration of power. None of the far-right or radicalized mainstream parties today have deep roots in mass-based social movements. They form linkages with church organizations and socially conservative groups, anti-minority groups. There is for sure, societal demand to fine-tune the state to mold it in the need of socially conservative groups and anti-minority groups, but there is no demand for a radical change and no demand for destruction. So unfortunately, so that's some good news. Unfortunately, there are fascist elements that are worthy of our attention. So number one is usable past. Fascism of the interwar war period is a usable past, thinking of the Iron Guard of Codreanu in Romania, Lenka Guard in Slovakia, arrow crosses in Hungary. The interwar and the war period is associated with sovereignty and independence. The communist past is associated with dependence and lost autonomy. And liberal democracy as a condition of the EU membership is viewed as a straitjacket, and a lot of these countries want out of this straitjacket. And so to rally around sovereignty, some political forces are reaching out for political symbolism and rhetoric to the pre-communist period associated with fascism. Of course, what we see in Eastern Europe today and Central Europe is a big rejection of individualism, pluralism, and minority rights. This is a message that resonates well with voters. In my own book that speaks to this issue, as it shows how acquisition of political power by ascendant minority groups precipitates a backlash of mobilization from the far right. And so to sum up, radical right mobilization capitalizes on rejection of pluralism. And let me, to conclude, meditate briefly on current events in Slovakia, Czech Republic, and Hungary. There is a very little demand for cultural progressivism in Central Eastern Europe. There is a great variety of populisms. Recently, two populists lost power. Fico's party Smer in Slovakia in 2020, right before COVID, and Babiš this October, to my big surprise. In both cases, Smer and ANO, these two populist parties, were defeated by a very diverse coalition that in both cases catered to moderate social conservative voters. That was Matovič's Olano and Fiala's coalition together Spolu. The same applies to Orban's challenger, Peter Markizai, who is a self-described right-wing Christian. So he will also lead a diverse coalition that will try to defeat Fidesz from the right. So I would not call the current zeitgeist in Central Eastern Europe fascist, but conservative, where the main cultural political battle lines are drawn around same-sex marriage, LGBTQ rights, abortion, and ethnic and minority rights. And I look forward to our discussion.
Thank you very much, Lenka. That was very crisp and clear, and also admirably timed. By the way, to the two speakers in the room, in order for people to hear us online, we don't exactly have to speak like fascist leaders, but we have to speak rather loudly and clear, I'm afraid. And to those who are listening online, if you have questions coming into your mind, if you can put them on the Q&A, I'll take them in as we go along.
Othon. Thank you, Tim. And I tried to kind of address two or three questions that you put to us. First of all, whether fascism is the right analytical tool to understand what is happening today. Why are people talking about fascism today more than they did 30 years ago. And what do we gain and what do we lose by using the F word? Now, let me start with the book that you mentioned, because when I studied the Greek military regime, the connections with the fascist past were much closer, although that was not a fascist regime. And most of the military, the colonels then, they were actually educated, their formative years were during the interwar period and the 1940s. And plus, one of the ideological pillars of that regime was a group that was called 4th of August regime, which made clear reference to the fascistoid dictatorship of the 1930s in Greece. Now, in my PhD, where I studied a comparison between fascist regimes and post-war military dictatorships, I actually made clear my definitional distinction in that we cannot use the term fascist in order to understand what happened in Europe after the Second World War. I believe that definitions matter. And when we are talking about fascism, we're actually talking about a very concrete period in Europe's history, where there are particular features about fascism. I mean, Jane did mention them all, and all of them work together in order to have this kind of phenomenon. But then, obviously, we know that the legacy of fascism and the memory of fascism was very, very big. The fact, obviously, that it resonated with so many parties in interwar Europe was indicative to that. We've seen an ideological nostalgia to begin with after the Second World War and the creation of the neo-fascist and the neo-Nazi formation. And then when we speak of today, we make reference to particular points. When we speak about that can relate to fascism, like authoritarianism, illiberalism, or censorship and oppression, or racism or ultranationalism. But then I believe there is much more to fascism than that. And Jane did mention the issue of mass mobilization, youth movement, charismatic leadership, and so on and so forth. So why do we speak more about fascism today? The answer is very obvious, because we've been going through a series of crises, Eurozone migration, Brexit, and nationalism and populism are on the rise. And also we've got far-right parties as well that are becoming much more prominent in the political landscape. The Eurozone crisis in particular was a kind of an automatic connection with the 1930s, given that it was the most severe after the 1929 crash, and what we saw in the 2010s was a similar kind of environment. So it was unavoidable that we had to think about whether that was leading to some form of authoritarianism like it did in the interwar period. And comparisons and references with the past are particularly important in my view, but more important is actually what lessons we learned from those periods. Obviously, by labeling Salvini, Trump, or Le Pen as fascists, we are making a point that they are dangerous to our democratic politics of today, and we need to use a stronger term in order to expose them. But comparisons can also confuse us, and that's why they should be used with caution, in my opinion. And most important for me is to have the right focus, because I believe that when we speak of fascists or populists, we're actually focusing on the leaders rather than on the problems that we are seeing with democracies today. We tend to look exclusively at them and how they suppress media, how they kind of don't respect the judiciary, the various institutions, how they're bypassing them in order to have a direct link with the people. And it is often the case that when we criticize Central, East, and Southeast European politics as backsliding, we've got these leaders in mind, and we don't pay much attention to the other pillars of their authority, that they are supported by parties, institutions, social groups, other politicians, economic elites, media themselves, are either actively or passively or through apathy and complacency. And at the same time, we know that there is also nowadays an angry backlash with some sectors of the population that need to express themselves politically and find anchoring in those parties of the extreme. This is the case, for instance, of the Golden Dawn, or even rising parties in Germany and Portugal. All three countries having gone through dictatorships, actually, and Greece having the memory of Nazi occupation too. And yet, we are seeing that these kind of formations are becoming important. And also to tell you that the jailing of Golden Dawn leaders and the designation of this party as a criminal organization has not eradicated the problem in Greece, in that there are voters who look for those alternative ultranationalist formation to express their anger, their reaction, and their resistance to mainstream politics. Obviously, there are this popularity of these parties has to do with this ultranationalist reaction to migration, but very important, the trust in politics as well. And also what we're seeing now during the pandemic, the conspiratorial thinking and the anti-vaccination campaign against scientists and against what we see as the big profits of the big pharmaceutical industries. There is a clientele for these parties. And just before I finish, I watched recently a very interesting BBC program, which was called The Rise of Nazis. Now, it didn't say much about originality because all the information was there. It was also good to look the visual material as well. But the main message of that is how the political elites, and that's what Jane said as well, they ease the way to, in a rather pluralist environment in Germany, how they ease the way to a kind of marginal leader, and the complacency and the miscalculation of these elites. And I would like to bring this today because that's the most important lesson for me from history. In what we're witnessing today, one thing is what Lenka said, the fragmentation of politics, but what I see as well is a turn to the right. And that kind of fragmentation or even disappearance of the center-left forces, the political spectrum is leaning to the right. And there we have a problem because then the political right in France or in the Central and East European countries as well, they have a very big dilemma in front of them, what to do with the far-right parties. And we've seen from the UK here, how Farage actually did dominate the Conservative Party choices, and also the miscalculations and the complacency of David Cameron. So the main dilemma of these parties is either to bring in those extremists within their parties in order to contain them, or in most of the cases, they actually appease the far right by using the rhetorics and some of the ideological elements. So just to conclude, in the end, it does not matter exactly how we call the illiberals of today, whether we call them populist or fascist. What they are doing is actually managing to manipulate the electorates and also to make the most of the deficiencies of the democratic system. It's the lessons of the past, really, that and the past practices with the rise of our democratic forces, which I believe is most important to look at.
Thank you very much, Othon. Interesting point I hope we'll come back to about the dilemmas of the center-right, which of course we're seeing in the French presidential election today, how far right you go to pick up those votes, which takes us straight to Tim.
Thanks so much for organizing this event. I've learned a lot from my co-panelists. The question I want to focus on today is it useful to use fascism as a comparator analytically and in terms of explanatory power? And I come at this question not as a historian of fascism, but as a political economist studying the electoral politics of far-right parties in Western Europe. And a lot of what I'm about to say is it's based on research with my former colleague at the University of Reading. So I want to analyze 3 ways in which I think it is a useful analytical and historical comparator, and 3 ways in which I think perhaps, in my view more compellingly, it is not. So let me start with a few ways in which I think the term is informative and useful. So first of all, I think the historical comparator shows that even parties with relatively extremist ideologies can become popular if there is a widespread breakdown of economic and political institutions and the legitimacy of actors. And I think here the case of Greece, where indeed a neo-Nazi party in a country that was occupied by Nazi forces made very significant and substantial gains, and that could only happen in the context of this massive breakdown. So that was point number one. Point number two, I think to be successful, fascist parties like far-right political parties need to not only mobilize the core, if you will, organic, kind of traditional constituents, but also mobilize beyond that towards the periphery, which has something to say about the ability to capture people whose ideology and preferences are not perfectly or totally or even mostly aligned with the policies that they propose. So think, for instance, of the need to mobilize both people with cultural grievances, perhaps traditional racist or xenophobic people, but also people who have other kinds of grievances of a more economic kind, for instance. And third, one thing that struck me comparing the recent times is the popularity of a welfare chauvinist platform towards which a lot of successful far-right parties have been moving in a context where both the center-left and the center-right parties have moved to a more so-called market liberal center of the political spectrum. And here I'm thinking in particular of the recent revival of a Bordeaux liberal focus on inflationary concerns at the expense of addressing more massive forms of insecurities in white parts of the electorate. Now, let me turn to the three ways in which I think this terminological use and historical comparisons it elicits often might not be optimal. First, analytically and conceptually, I think there's some really prominent definitional differences. What they have in common: opposition to Marxism, nationalism, sexism, skepticism, if not outright opposition of parliamentary democracy, and populism, with the latter occupying perhaps an excessive share of our recent attention. What they don't have in common, or no longer have in common, especially in successful cases: totalitarian ambitions, imperialism, the advocacy of violence and military values was mentioned. But also more recently, the conservative economic programs or oppositions to cultural liberalism. You see a relative decline of its emphasis programmatically, which is not to say that the core of the party might not hold these values dearly amongst all its memberships. And I'm thinking in particular here of the successful transformation, from an electoral point of view, of the Front National and its openness among its core members, at least, and some of these messages to these different positions. And these differences, second point, in characteristics and message then change the explanatory dynamics on what I would call the supply side. The ability of a particular message to elicit support to be more or less successful electorally. And it's often those far-right parties that are more radical rather than extremist that have been the most successful. And by radical instead of extremist, I mean a movement away from the advocacy of violence and demise of democracy in totality, and the severage of explicit or implicit links with fascist origins or ideology, for the purpose of doing better electorally, not because I'm not ascribing a genuine sense of belief of those parties, but for strategic purposes. They have changed some of the elite membership and some of the messages. Similarly, many far-right parties have moved towards a civic nationalist rather than ethnic nationalist conception of nation states. We hold common values and not we are a common people, to try and broaden their base beyond people who are perhaps put off by the classic ethnic nationalist messaging. And third and final point, I think it is not useful in an explanatory way on the demand side to understand a lot of the motivations that lead now people to vote for far-right parties. It's no longer just the racist, xenophobic, or populist motives, but that kind of capture most of the motivation of most of the voters in successful cases. But now you have other non-xenophobic, non-populist motives, which have been talked about, protest motivations, Euroscepticism, but also I would want to emphasize various forms of absolute and relative economic deprivation. And with the relative deprivation, I have in mind social class decline, the aspirations of people, that are unable to be met for class ascension and the rest of it. So in conclusion, I think a comparison across countries and time is crucial to understand the phenomenon, but I think on balance, the cross-sectional variation in the recent and present moment is more helpful to understand what's going on than a comparison to fascism. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tim. That was a superb set of introductory comments. I'm going to give the panelists a chance to see if they would like to react quickly to anything that has been said by any other panelists. If there's anything where you feel really moved immediately to respond. And I'm also looking to Lenka in Arizona, whether there was anything you particularly wanted to respond to directly. Or Jane.
Yeah. Do you mind if I go ahead as long as the technology is working? I just have a very brief point. I didn't talk about economic grievances and the importance of redistribution, but but I would like to emphasize that there is a big part of this, big realignment is really that the right-wing parties are becoming parties that very intelligently use redistribution and targeted economic transfers to keep voters happy and support them. And so this sort of is very similar to what Tim was saying, that this combination of welfare chauvinism, of excluding some groups from transfers, but also being, a big part of the appeal is really the ability to provide voters with welfare transfers and economic support. So that's part of the big appeal as well.
Can I just add to that? I think it's very interesting because Viktor Orbán and Fidesz is a classic example of this. Very carefully targeted economic/social handouts to different sections of society, but then crucially, and this goes to what everybody has been saying, what I would call a strategy of aggregation. You have to bring all those people, those different social interests together, and you do that by what I think they call the politics of resentment. A very strong narrative of the heroic victim martyr nation, which of course in the Hungarian case is so easy because you have Trianon, so you're the perennial victim of history, and it's that powerful nationalist narrative that makes this politics of aggregation and enables you to bring together these different social interests. So with that, I'm sure we've got, yes, Othon.
Yeah, one point I would like to raise here is that we should really make a distinction between, what we see as the governments of Orban or Kaczynski and the more extreme neo-Nazi, neo-fascist parties, because often when we see these parties that they have to cooperate in government, they also tend to mollify their rhetoric and try and become more mainstream. This is probably what Marine Le Pen is trying to do right now, and she's facing a similar opposition from another far-right party. But they do have the tendency also themselves to soften their extreme rhetoric.
Well, I think just, I think the one thing I would sort of try to draw from some of the contributions that have been made is this question of of what the political response is. And I do think, this is perhaps difficult for, I'm not sure if this resides at the level of the electorate or what, but I'm struck by the difference in the treatment of Trump by the Republican Party, which is prepared for him. They have spent decades preparing to have somebody who will allow them to solve the problem that they don't have in the foreseeable future under the existing American constitutional system, the chance of maintaining themselves in power. And this was clear to them, at the time of the second Clinton term. And so the party, even before that, had been preparing itself for precisely the kinds of electoral manipulations which are now sweeping America. It's an extraordinarily, the sort of process of a constitutional coup going on in America is, I think, the contrast between that, and unless I'm, kind of overly impressed by appearances, the contrast between that and Merkel's, the CDU's refusal to work with the Alternative für Deutschland, so that the AfD is at the moment isolated in the Bundestag. Now, whether that will survive, I don't know, but nobody will make a coalition with the AfD, no party. I mean, under the current coalition talks, they're not overtly a player. Maybe I'm missing what goes on behind the scenes, but that seems to me to, in some senses, you need the centre parties to be resistant to the blandishments of the authoritarians. And how that has been outflanked in Poland and Hungary, I mean, and not quite yet in France, but it's going on, as you say. That seems to me to be an urgent question.
I mean, I think just picking up on that, it seems to me we have on the table an interesting comparison, which is the US-European comparison, because on several of these key issues, like the issue of political violence or the reaction of mainstream parties, you have at the moment a rather clear difference. And the question would be partly about political culture and history, but it would also be about the EU and whether the EU is in any sense a meaningful constraint. I think with that, I'm going to throw it open. Can I say for those who are listening online, the Q&A thing is open. So if you could put your questions in the Q&A. I can see several hands already here, so I think I'll just take 3 questions, if I may. And if you could identify yourselves for the microphones, I'll go here, here, and Paul.
Jan Parfel, second year Oslo School. I just wanted to make a small comment at the beginning about the interdisciplinary nature of this talk, because it reminds me of a classical debate of intellectual history where you have contextualist approach with Quentin Skinner versus idealist approach like Arthur Lovejoy, for example. But moving to the things that were discussed today, I just wanted to point out that another way of comparison between the 20s and now might be facilitated by technological advancements. So the rise of fascism was usually associated with the arrival of radio, whereas now we have social media, so that might be one point. But I generally would like also to refer to what Othon mentioned, that the current role of anti-vaxxers who are also appropriating the certain strategies of the classical civil resistance, which shows that the problem of contemporary vocabulary is not only related to fascism, but also to our liberal own values, where we have appropriation. But given the comparison between the past and present, and also US and EU, I wanted to ask whether it shouldn't make more sense to focus more on the contemporary idea of the culture wars, whether that wouldn't be more beneficial to explain the current situation we ended up in.
Thank you very much.
Daniel Hardy, European Studies Center. First, a sort of comment/question. You make the point that the traditional fascists are often disruptive, but they're also meant to make the trains run on time. So isn't also one distinction, used also by Tim's, some articles by you, in some are disruptive to administration, and others, particularly Orban, perhaps even Erdogan, were effective. And they're the more dangerous ones, the guys who actually deliver the bread and circus. So that the difference also across the Atlantic or between countries in that dimension. And also going to just, if you anticipate my question, is the discussion mercifully free of the question of the use of media and particularly the use of the internet to reduce deference and also manipulation abroad. But do you think they can be overplayed, this issue about the role of the internet? Because every seminar I go to about it, it goes on and on about it.
Thank you very much, Daniel.
Paul Betts, European Studies Center. I mean, it's generally argued that fascism is the only new ideology of the 20th century in terms of the spectrum. And I agree with the way James characterized that. We generally think of fascism as being anti-communist, anti-liberal, but it's also anti-throne and altar, right? It's not in the sense of restoration, at least historically, not the restoration of the monarchy, it's not the restoration of the idea of the church. It certainly posits the idea of a reconciliation with old conservative forces, but it's hyper-modern, hyper-secular in that way. I mean, you think you're right that the First World War and the Russian Revolution act as kind of midwives for this particular ideology. One thing that it's also linked to territorial revisionism, right? Whether it be a lost war in Germany's case or lost peace in Italy's case. And I don't see if you want to call it contemporary fascism, it has any designs on territory. It seems much more of a kind of defense of a siege community and the defense of a nation. And I was thinking about Tim Vlandas's point, and I think I'm sympathetic to this idea that we are really hung up with this idea of labeling, that it might be actually quite dangerous. I mean, if we think about the origins of fascism, it was a positive self-descriptor for the Italian fascists in the 1920s. It becomes a term of derision, of course, in the Cold War. Anything that's in a sense kind of anti-West or pro-Soviet. I guess the question is then, what do we, maybe it's just like Tim Vlandas is saying, a kind of radical nationalism, that these people, maybe we should take seriously the fact that the Trumpites, the people Golden Dawn, Marine Le Pen don't like the term, and it doesn't, for them, describe what they're actually doing, and actually think that when they describe themselves as radical or as engaged nationalists, it is, in a sense, a kind of anti-leftist, anti-liberal idea of nationalism, which has a particular position on the political spectrum, and that maybe it's, I think, might be better just to begin with that description, understand them on their own terms. And I think also we as historians get caught up with this idea of what fascists say. I mean, it's one of those ideologies too that doesn't have its sacred texts, unlike communism and liberalism, right? I mean, Mein Kampf is not read by many people. Mussolini wrote a couple of encyclopedia articles. It's not to say they can go back to a font of words that matter. It's just about actions, and they change their messages very, very quickly depending on audience. It's not an ideology that is consistent rhetorically. And we, in a sense, need to understand that it shifts message very, very quickly. But Tim was talking about this kind of, it's a denial of pluralism, but it's one in which its messages change. And just think about this as a kind of radical nationalism. And it's part of that particular story, but fascism, I think, at times gets in the way of describing what in fact is actually happening.
Jane, would you like to take that one?
Well, I mean, more or less, I agree. And I think the contributions of the panel have been fantastically helpful for me and very interesting to I think the invocation of civic nationalism is very helpful, because I think, that for the European context, it's not so clear in the American context, where race is crucial, and that's another major difference, I think. I mean, for some analysts, race is the issue in America, the issue to understand what is happening to the American polity. Now, I didn't mention anti-Semitism. I realized when I was talking about this, because I think, I mean, maybe somebody was going to bring that up. I'll bring it up as an auto-critique, if you like. And it looks like that which, after all, was such a crucial part of German fascism, and certainly, as we understand now, increasingly an integral element of Italian fascism, doesn't have the same purchase, even though it's there too. I mean, it's not disappeared. But what I remain struck by this all the time, that the historians have been very reluctant to use the term fascism. And as I say, it's not because we have a consensus on what we understand fascism to be. It's that it seems. I mean, this was an old debate among historians whether fascism is epochal and confined to a particular, not just period, but geographical location, or whether it has a wider purchase. And that's been on and on and on and on. The most recent contribution to these debates has been a recent volume, which is globalizing the concept of fascism, which I haven't had a chance to look at properly, but it's trying to kind of put, as it were, the empire and the global back into fascism, and not just talking about nameless candidates like Japan. And I just wonder whether that's going to make things more difficult to. If we're talking about, I mean, we're talking about two sets of usable concepts here. I think one is intellectually, so that we sort of have some sense of what it is we're dealing with, so that we can have a dialogue about it. And that's really what it means of shared dialogue. But the other is this question of what is politically the most important way to understand, to grasp what's happening now. Because I presume, and this is not an assumption that made in the University of Germany in 1939, that nobody here is a partisan of any of the regimes or would-be regimes we've been talking about. So, we want to find the means to allow us to understand how we combat the politics of the present, the authoritarian politics of the present, from a variety of different political positions. I mean, I would think I began a talk some years ago by asking anybody in the room who identified as a fascist to raise their hand. And of course, nobody did. That has an important resonance, I think, for how we're thinking.
So if anyone would like to speak up for fascism, please do raise your hand or online. Othon, Tim, would you like to take one of those two other points, namely efficacy and the internet and social media? Either of you like to tackle either of those? Or Lenka, if you want to come in.
Yeah, thank you. I think media is very important. We know that there is a very strong association between declining media freedoms and democratic backsliding. And now I'm talking about sort of traditional media, TV and newspapers. This is what the ruling parties in Poland, Czech Republic, and Hungary went after. And then there is this whole universe of social media that leads to, as we know, fragmentation, polarization, and amplification of conspiracy theories, because unfortunately it is profitable to post divisive messages. And so we know that Zuckerberg is under a lot of pressure to address this, and I have doubts that he will be able to do it. And so, I mean, I have mentioned that fragmentation is sometimes positive, but unfortunately social media create a direct link between leaders and voters, and this destroys traditional political parties. So when you are then in a situation when you want to defeat a populist parties, what we are seeing now is that it's done through coalitions of parties, very diverse coalitions. And you know, once you destroy traditional parties as a mediator between voters and leaders, it really becomes difficult to push back. So that's where I view, so from the electoral perspective, the danger of social media. Not to mention, I mean, conspiracy theories would be another debate here.
Thank you, Lenka. Tim.
Yes, I mean, just on the far right, briefly. So, I mean, for me, the phenomenon is there's a far right party family. It has different shades. It's more or less radical or extreme, and that extremism defines or characterizes its degree of overlap with the elements of fascist ideology, right? So, you know, you think of the spectrum between an FN and the Golden Dawn as presently, you know, formed. It's quite clear that in one case you have much more advocacy of violence and much more rejection of democracy and military organization of the party structure than in the other. And I think also that then fits into what makes both parties more or less successful, right? Which leads me to the point of efficacy versus inefficacy. I mean, that only applies once they're in government, right? When they're not in government, I think what then is crucial is, on the contrary, the inefficacy of the governing parties in addressing, subjectively or objectively, the grievances, legitimate or not, of parts of the electorate, right? So I would turn it on its head and say, actually, at that level, before they get in government, they don't need to be efficient, right? All they need is the governing parties to be widely inefficient at addressing some issues. And social media, maybe, you know, I think indeed it's the big absent of this panel's talk, but I think I wouldn't assume necessarily it's always crucial. I mean, there was a bit of this discussion also with Brexit. I think there are wider structural drivers among the electorate and wider systemic issues in the ability of the economic and political system to manage those grievances. And then, yes, at the margin, maybe social media helps you carrying out a message. But you know, the message has to be palatable by people, and it's difficult to brainwash 55% of the electorate with Twitter. And some of these parties were doing relatively well in the 1990s, early 2000s, when, you know, you have much less of this.
Let me just add, sorry, hold on. But can I just add one thing on the, because I thought about this, about social media, internet. I mean, obviously, Nazism uses the radio as an enormously powerful tool of conveying one message repeatedly to a huge audience. The internet does not do that. It rather has a fragmentation effect. What the internet does help, and there's very good studies on this, is hyperpolarization. It's the echo chamber effect that you see in the US, but that's something different, rather different from the mass mobilization of a large part of society, as we saw in fascism.
Just on this, I would like to differ a little bit in how important I see the role of social media. not so much in the national context of the countries, but much more in transnational. I mean, it's no coincidence that what we're seeing now is that Orban has bought already, conventional media in Slovenia or North Macedonia. How the Russians are actually using social media. So it's a kind of a spoiler effect, and obviously the transmission of this kind of illiberalism in a kind of more generic kind of way. I believe their media, social media, are particularly significant in how they transcend borders, basically.
Terrific. Thanks very much. Okay, so I've got Martin, Tristan, Charles, one more, two more. Right. I've got 8 questions, including those online. So if you could be relatively brief in your questions, I think I'll take them in threes. Martin.
European Studies Center and visiting professor from Munich. Well, one short remark. I think it makes sense to draw a distinction between fascist governments and fascist movements or parties. Fascist governments can be integrating, and language maybe is not so important. I think the point Lenka made is very important, that youth plays a role. And if discussing it in this way, I would say Russia is really a state which can be discussed under this label of fascism. It has a strong leader, a cult of personality. The youth movement is used by the government. And you have fascist language, which is contributed from the church. This shows that fascist ideologies not always must be radical secularist, but can use also, as in the interwar period, Slovakia can use religious semantics. And the irony, of course, is that it is Russia which blames Ukraine to be a fascist state. That is some sort of interesting inversion.
Thank you very much, Martin. Charles.
Yeah, one observation and a question. I was surprised what Othon says, that when fascists get into government, they soften. I mean, I'm not aware of any. I mean, if you look at the Orbans or Kaczynskis, it's just progressive. Eliminate more and more judges, close more and more media. It goes on, and we haven't yet got to the end point, fortunately, of any of these. But I don't think, I don't think they do sort of suddenly get more inclusive once they're there. My question is, what is the role net of the European Union? I mean, on the one hand, there's the constitution will be democratic, but have all this and the other, and there's the European Court of Justice, which sets limits. I mean, in practice, it's more efficient in the sense before a country gets in than after it gets in. Once you've got a Hungary or Poland, they don't do any. I mean, what are the restraints? It's always a bogeyman there. And in fact, the way it works, the EU gives large amounts of money to some of these countries. I mean, there's an argument they're going to keep Orbán in power now, because the deal was that the last EU budget will go through, and the human rights aspects will not be included till after the coming election in Hungary, which gives Orbán a great chance to actually use the money for as he wishes. So I wonder if you've got views on any of this, or how the EU would lay out this.
Thank you, Charles. Christian. Thank you. If you could identify yourself for the mic.
Yes, Christian Pilanovsky, default student of pro-natalist policies. One recurring theme today has been this move of mainstream center-right parties further to the right to sort of block far-right challengers. And I feel like we've all agreed here today that that's fairly morally regrettable. But there has also been this assumption that it has been electorally effective for these parties, especially vis-a-vis Hungary and Poland. But then I wonder if there aren't any counter cases where mainstream center-right parties have gone further to the right at their own peril, in a way. And perhaps the decline of center-right options in France and Italy comes to mind. But I wonder, I'm not an expert on this country, so I wonder if this happened because they tried too hard to block far-right parties, or maybe too little. And if there is any empirical research, cross-country research, which has tested this with us. Thank you.
Very interesting question. I think I'll take one more. Yeah, yeah. So you go, Matt, yeah.
You go first.
All right. Okay. I don't know.
Okay, Anastasakis, I'm from the University of Warsaw and the visiting professor at the Russian and Eastern European Studies here this year. And I would like to come back to gender and sexuality issues that appeared in both of your voices, but somehow disappeared later on. And just two questions around them. How do you see the difference between the uses of gender and sexuality in today, not fascist movement, but in those fascist elements? What's the difference between today's gender and sexuality and back in the 1930s? And how do you see that today's version developed in the current form? The attack on LGBT movements and anti-abortion and so on.
It might make sense for me to ask my question
That's
because
I
knew referring to each other because I knew we were both going to ask about gender. Elizabeth Wood, MIT academic visitor here at Balliol College for the fall. I'm a Russian historian and working on current events. And I wanted to concur completely Jane Caplan's idea that these are very difficult to define terms. My colleague Betül Ekşi and I tried to figure this out for populism in Turkey and Russia. And what we found was that what's really interesting about gender is the ways in which it serves to disrupt the order while claiming to be going back to an older order. And so one of the things I think might be interesting to bring gender into the picture, as I think has been done, is to say, can we think about these as neo-fascists, that they are borrowing from a certain toolbox from the 1930s, from the classical fascism, where the bad boys disrupt while claiming to bring in order. And here we're seeing it really in the States. I mean, you're absolutely right. The January 6th attack on the Capitol, they were called the Proud Boys, but they're really sort of infantile youth gone amok, who think that they can, and so they create this pitch of the bad boys versus the elite who are effete, who are emasculated. And so I think as long as there's that tension, my question is, and also to support this idea that Tim had of the family of the far right, is how do we, and it sort of goes back to also the other question, how do we get out of this? If our democracy is going to withstand, in the US, we've got death threats against election officials because these vigilantes trying to act out this violence. How do we create a more robust sense of a democracy that isn't thrown apart by this paradoxical bad boys, old paternal, good fathers, etc.? It seems quite challenging to figure out how it's going to be. And now Orban is being touted on US right-wing television, Fox News, because he's strongly defending the borders. Again, a masculine ideal that needs to be. So it's very bizarre. The US, which is so isolationist on these kinds of things, suddenly is looking to Europe and taking the worst. So, sorry, long question.
Thank you very much. Jane, do you want to start on the gender question?
Let me try that. I mean, I think the thing about, where to begin? Clearly, the fascist movements in their incarnation as the fascist movements in some sense never recovered. The fascist man never recovered from the First World War as a threat both to as a scene of masculinity, but a threat to masculinity, because in the end they didn't manage. They were defeated. So, but there is a sort of, there is clearly the whole repertoire of fascist mobilization is highly masculinized. And then we have to remember, of course, at the same time that there were paramilitary groups on the left, of course. But I think, if you look at the performances of Republican, the Republican public or Republicanism in Weimar Germany, they do draw on a repertoire of drilling and of uniformed appearance and so on. But the language, the culture, the tone of it, I think, is different. It's not this kind of hyper insistence on the hardness of the male fighter. But when it comes down to policy after 1933, at least I mean, both in Germany and in Italy, I mean, again, many years of difference and so on. But basically, there's nothing so much in the anti-feminist rhetoric and policy which wasn't there already, and isn't sort of, the common coin of basically anti-feminist societies. So, the Nazis can make a great ploy of bringing women back into motherhood and so on and so forth. But, as we know, in the end, they don't manage to do that. I mean, in fact, they realize they need women's labor, and the same in Italy. So I think that there are other implications which are connected with sex and gender, which have to do with the elimination of unwanted sorts of people. So the whole euthanasia program, it is part of I mean, you can't extract it from the field of anti-feminist policies, although of course men too were sterilized. But it's that kind of thing, which is is I'm not going to say it's entirely separate from gender policy, but underneath it is just a raft of attitudes, policies, visual imagery, which is not so different from the public sphere generally. And when it is different, you can also point to the places where actually, the Nazis don't entirely, nor do the Italian fascists control the public sphere. So women go on behaving in ways they're not supposed to. And the most important part of it, I think, is that they're both highly maternalist regimes, and that's what is required to raise birth rates and get birth rates of the right kind. That's what we're talking about. And just very briefly on, we haven't just a comment on the screen.
Can I just add on that point that I just put on the table the question whether the fact of the spectacular decline of birth rates in a number, particularly West European countries, but also some East European countries, and therefore the maternalist/pronatalist argument, notably Othon, but also Kaczynski and others, gets mixed up with the dialogue about the grand remplacement, the replacement of the population by Muslim immigrants and so on. And that does seem to be an element which is distinctive and new. Lenka, would you like to take any of those questions that were just asked, either on the gender point or strategies of center-right parties?
Yeah, there are so many great questions. Let me briefly comment on the culture wars and the far-right parties, mainstream right parties strategies. I think Eastern Europe is in the middle of culture wars, but they're very thin. And one of the beauties of the region is that there is a lot of fluidity and entrepreneurial spirit and creativity. So you can be at the same time a party with a history of anti-Semitism, but embracing Netanyahu and going to Yad Vashem. The same issue applies to issues of gender and LGBTQ. This was not an issue in the 1990s. This has become an issue recently for a variety of reasons. One is, the birth rates, but also, gay relationships are threats to organic solidarity, undermine traditional families. And some of this is anticipatory because there have been rulings by the European courts that, for example, the countries know that down the line they will have to ban on gay marriage. So if you are a gay couple, when one of the parents is Slovak and you adopt children in Netherlands, there are some rulings that basically extend these rights, these family rights to Slovakia, which is in a way a breakthrough to the Slovak, legal sovereignty over these issues. So I think these countries see that there is a writing on the wall. So there are a couple of articles written on this backlash as an anticipatory backlash against, future legal arrangements. And I think in terms of economy, some of these parties can walk and chew gum at the same time. They can target voters, but also lower taxes and implement flat taxes. Orbán pursues very neoliberal economic policies. Workers and welfare protection in general in Hungary is very bad, but at the same time, he is capable of targeting voters. So I think, and the same, for example, the Bandera issue in Ukraine, Russia. This was not an issue in the 1990s. This is a re-emerging new, culture of all the usable past. So I think in some way, as these countries are very creative, some of these culture wars go in and out. For example, immigration threat has declined as an issue, and sort of moving on to the issue of when it paid. So Babiš in this election really tried to fearmonger on immigration. That didn't work at all. Slovak mainstream right-wing they're left on economy, right on identity. They were in coalition with the far right. They tried anti-immigration rhetoric, and it spectacularly backfired. In other instances, it pays off. So I would say there's one lesson about, what is the lesson about far right challenges being accommodated or a cordon sanitaire? We see all sorts of configurations, and we see also that it can, there can be fluctuations over time. So sometimes, Confederacja is now a threat, but Law and Justice Party was in coalition with the League of Polish Families at some point. So again, probably it's not, people want parsimony and universalism, and this region offers a lot of configurations that are counterintuitive and very innovative, and it makes it fun to study, but difficult to generalize.
Thank you very much. Tim, Othon, did you want to comment on either of those? Centre-right populist?
On this particular, just had an example to give Christian, from the Greek case of, of the center-right government, how it actually gets all its good material in terms of ministers and capability from the center left, and how it was the politicians from the far right in order to be able to get the voters from there. I think that's a very interesting combination on how the government of New Democracy, and that has to do with how fragmented the center-left space is. That it allows for its best people actually to go with the right parties. And if I may just quickly, because Charles raised a question, what I wanted to convey with what I said before is that that space, which is the extreme right fascist state, is also very fragmented itself. And there are so many disagreements between them too. What I said at the beginning is, because I'm obsessed with this definition of distinctions, is that I wouldn't categorize Orban as a fascist government. I mean, it's a majoritarian, government that needs 50+1 in order to survive. And obviously, but the extreme right parties, they have a similar dilemma as the right-wing parties as well. If they want to cooperate in power, they actually have to decide whether they're going to soften their rhetoric and get wider kind of electorate, or whether they will continue to be in opposition and keep this reactionary anti-stance.
Yeah, I mean, maybe just a general comment first, and then to specific questions. I think the general comment is to separate as much as possible normative from positive considerations, right? Because otherwise, especially if you come at it from a left-wing perspective, you end up ascribing as problematic and as the explanation of the phenomenon a lot of things you dislike on normative grounds, right? And aside from whether or not these normative issues are valid or not, and they are, I think that gets you in trouble analytically then in terms of what's going on. So to the specific questions, Euroscepticism plays a role. Most Eurosceptic voters stand in the recent past to support the far right. But I think that's not a core ideology, because they are very plastic and adaptable, the far right parties. And in cases where the political spectrum was constituted differently, they were quite happy to be pro-European. Or in countries that are highly pro-European, if there's only 2 or 3% who are Eurosceptic, you won't see a far right party who wants to gain power move into that space, which I think leads us to the question of what's epiphenomenal and what's not in those aspects. So Europe is one case. Gender is a similar case. Yes, a lot of these parties, at least in the past, recently they're moving, have quite conservative, if not traditional, if not outright reactionary views on gender. But they're not the only parties historically that had these these views. And so it begs the question, is that gender conservativeness what's explaining the success, and or is that what's motivating people to vote for them as opposed to other characteristics that they might have? So for instance, you could argue perhaps the gender messaging is about lost status. And so young males of certain classes, perhaps with parents who were of better classes, are driven to pick up on status messages, right? And so one could be, this, but the other one could be the anti-elitist, we've been betrayed, kind of logic. So, and then finally on the center-right, far-right dilemma, I mean, I think there's good research showing that when far-right parties enter parliament, the right moves even more to the right. And my sense is on whether, legitimation, or when the center-right moves to the far-right, there's a question whether you have a legitimation element, so that increases support for the far-right. And then you've got a kind of occupation of the space element, which decreases support. I think we have both effects. On the net, my understanding for the Western European case is that legitimation dominates. So the far-right ideas become more palatable, more acceptable. So a lot of people who are kind of, closet racists suddenly think, oh, it's acceptable for me to vote for the FN. They're not that different from Fillon, as an example, right? I mean, I'm not making the case that they are similar. I'm just saying this is the logic, yeah.
Thanks, Tim. We're close to the end of our time. I'm going to take the two last questions, just give you the ones from online, and then go in reverse order through the panels. So I think you had a question, yes? Or...
No, but I do actually have to ask one.
Well, you have a
Matthew Porges, the postdoctoral fellow in anthropology. You mentioned the militarization of politics as a difference between the American and European expressions of the far-right gun culture in America, particularly as a vector of militarization. I was wondering if you could speak to the militarization of migration and border enforcement in Europe as a possible vector of militarization of European politics.
Thanks very much. Listen.
Yes, Lisbeth Agistan, academic visitor.
If you could speak up a bit for
Yes,
people.
Lisbeth Agistan, academic visitor at the European Studies Center. Thank you for really interesting presentations on this topic. I mean, I think there is a distinction between using academic analytical concepts where we use definitions, that they are not necessarily true or false, but they're analytical definitions to describe a phenomena. But what I would like to really call attention to is how, to go back to Timothy's introduction, that it's actually the word fascist is used very much by the liberal left as well to attribute to the far-right parties. And in my own country, Sweden, this has been used very much as a strategy to try to isolate the New Democrats, which do have neo-Nazis roots originally. But it's used as a strategy, but it's really backlash, which means today that we have a party in Sweden that in the next election in the autumn might get 20%. It's currently possibly the second largest party in Sweden. So using that term fascist have had a backlash, if you like, in Sweden, because that has been a strategy to isolate that party. And I just wonder if that could be something you could reflect on briefly.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. Very interesting question. I'm going to give you the number of two questions from online. Adrian Cheesty says, basically, what about economic fascism? Does one see national protectionism and corporatism, interventionist industrial policy, as being some component of this story? And Stefan Schwed asks where free speech fits into this. Does it fit in as being the internet empowering everyone to say anything, including lots of hate speech, or does it rather fit in as a rallying cry of the far right? We're defending free speech. 60 years ago, it was young people on the left who were defending free speech. Now it's old people on the right who are the great champions, even in this university, of free speech. So where does free speech fit into this? And if I may just slip in a question of my own. I mean, we've talked about the EU, and Charles made the important point that particularly in Poland and Hungary, these regimes are to a significant degree delivering to segments of their societies with EU funds. So to that extent, they are sustained by the EU as well as constrained. But let's remember that historically, many fascists were very, in their own view, pro-European. That is to say, they had their own vision of Nation Europa. Let me remind you that Oswald Mosley, the leader of the British Union of Fascists, rebranded himself after the Second World War as the champion of European Union. He edited a magazine called The European. He stood as a champion for European Union. And if you look at what Viktor Orbán says, and to some extent Kaczynski, although Orbán more, he is precisely articulating an alternative vision of Europe. It's not right to describe in his view as anti-European. It's simply an alternative, and some might say fascist vision of Europe. So where does that element fit into our picture? We'll go in reverse order. So Tim, feel free to pick and choose.
Yes, thanks. So I think great question, and I think there is a link between the sort of Sweden case, which was very interesting on the use of the fascist labor, and the free speech kind of issue, insofar as I would ascribe that to perhaps the post-structuralist term progressive thought, but I think that's a bit beyond what we're discussing today. But I think there's been a left strategy to say the way to fight these issues and these competing political movements is to try and shut them out on quote unquote moral grounds. And I think that by and large, although it's hard in the essence of a sort of historical counterfactual, the strategy has failed, right? Or at least that's my reading. And so I suppose that the sort of commonality in both these things is there are underlying grievances and positions among wide spectrums of the electorate, and you need to somehow address them, which does not mean you need to address them in the same way, which would then legitimate, and you have the legitimation cost electorally, but you need to somehow not have a response which is purely moralistic. Yeah. You're not allowed to say this, you are a fascist movement. And so because I think it raises questions democratically, at least in liberal democracies, but it also, I think, has proved ineffective in the last 20 years, as far as I can tell. And the other questions were great too, but in the spirit of self-moderation, I will stop here.
Very impressive, Tim. I mean, I think it's just to add one sentence to that. The question of the efficacy of criminalizing parties of the far right is a really important one here. Othon.
Let me just address your issue about the pro-Europeanism of these parties. And I think we've got a difference there between the countries that are bigger states, much more confident in terms of their own economy, in terms of their own administrative structures. You know, when we see far-right parties there, they're actually anti-European because they believe that they can make it on their own. They don't need Brussels to tell them what to do. In the countries of the periphery, either they are clearly European and using European funding and everything in order to advocate their liberal cause, or in the cases of Southeast Europe and Golden Dawn in particular, they never mentioned the European issue. They just acted. They never engaged with it. This is because those countries are very conscious of their own peripheral status and their dependence on the European Union.
Very interesting. Lenka.
Yeah, thank you. What a fascinating debate. So very briefly, I think fascism in some countries is a badge of honor. So it won't be, it's not a label. Fascists fought communists, communists were bad. So if you're labeled as a Banderite in Western Ukraine, it's not an issue. And to some degree, it applies to Lenka as well. I think with the freedom of speech, I think it's there are different layers to it. One is whether you want to force commercial companies such as Facebook and Twitter to change their algorithms, and that's an issue of whether they can make profit on violence and polarization. And then there is an issue of security, of national security. For example, when the Czech Republic kicked most of the employees of the Russian embassy, there was a massive decline in social media activity. So that's just an evidence. There was a huge troll farm. So I think in those ways, it's absolutely appropriate to force changes in the algorithms, really take hybrid war seriously. But other than that, it's, free speech is a sort of fundamental pillar of European identity. On the and final point, Europe, of course, Viktor Orban thinks he and to some way Kaczynski, or they think they are defending the true Europe. So they have a different vision of Europe, which is much more socially conservative. I think in some way it is a legitimate vision of Europe in the sense that there are some aspects of social conservatism that are absolutely mainstream and acceptable. So unfortunately he's using that to expand power, but I think it's not helpful to engage in labeling, but in a discussion with how to deal with legitimate mainstream social conservative movement and socially conservative ideology, and sort of bring them into the mainstream and build a wall that so they cannot be used for more extreme forms of political representation.
Thank you, Lenka. I think that's a very important point for those of you who didn't catch it. It's a great mistake, it seems to me, to make the main point of attack on someone like Viktor Orban is social conservatism. And I think the EU is to some extent in danger of making that mistake. The main point of attack on Viktor Orban is this is a man who has dismantled democracy in a member state of the European Union, and we should keep the focus on that rather than on the social conservatism. Jane.
Well, I have two things to say. I think one is that, of course, fascism haunts the European imaginary, and it can't be uninvented, so it's going to shadow discussions at this time. But in some ways, I think it's actually not fascism that has that spectral place, but it's the defeat of fascism, which is so important. And that's why I think it's so durable as an issue. It is one thing that many people can agree on. It was a major achievement in some senses with the mid-20th century to be able to destroy the two major fascist regimes in Europe, the warmongering fascist regimes. And I think that is, that's still with us and no more powerful, I think, than in this country, where there's virtually no other point of national consensus, I think, other than we did good things in the Second World War. The other thing is that I think, this is very spongy ground, especially for a historian, but I think our horizons have been limited to the past and the present. But, in these weeks in particular, I think we have to look ahead a bit and think about what we're talking about, regimes in what's going to be very soon a rapidly changing world of either collaboration or defensiveness or autarkic policies in relation to the global climate challenge. That, of course, goes back to the question of the militarization of borders, which is, I don't think Britain is leading the way in that, frankly, but that honor would go to, that disgrace could go to several other European countries and certainly to America, including before Trump. But that kind of, the kinds of decisions that are going to face countries, authoritarian and non-authoritarian, are going to be vectors of potentially radical political choices, I think, and we probably should be thinking ahead to that future as much as we are looking back to the fascist past or the defeated fascism past.
Thank you very much, Shane and Tamil. I don't want to use that old quip about being confused, but at a higher level, but it's true to some extent. Although actually, for myself, and this has been a fantastic discussion, I do have a sort of, I come away with a kind of conclusion, because the question posed to the panel was, should we talk about fascism in Europe today? And I feel the answer is probably no. Jane, in her history workshop, piece has a wonderful phrase about fascism suffering from an excess of definition.
That is a quotation. It's not mine. It is not. I don't think it's mine. I can't say it.
Right. Anyway, it's a great phrase, but it seems to me now with all these books, that is even more true. That is to say, we're getting a massive excess of definition. And at the same time, it's obviously problematic to use this term, which is highly historicized, which has a very strong regional and epochal location. So that to talk about fascism in a positive sense doesn't seem to be very useful. But I think what this discussion has shown is that if you take it in Jane's wonderful phrase as being good to think with, if you take it as a source of comparisons and contrasts, it's immensely illuminating. And one ends up actually seeing, as I think Lenka said, fascist elements, fascist traces, which are really, I think, illuminating. So that's at least my very tentative personal conclusion, which is only to say, I think this has been an absolutely wonderful discussion. Thanks for this terrific panel, and thank you all very much indeed.
Thank you very much.